This is going to be my second AMA here for my side channel. Now, obviously, the simplest way to support my side channel and my work here is through the Patreon. If you give $10 a month or more, you can ask a question in each edition. If you give $25, I also am doing a feature where there is a poll every few episodes where I gather together some of the best questions I think can become their own video. The first one was already held, and the winner will be a video about unearned wisdom, which I will do on this channel forthcoming. Secondly, another way you can support me is you can buy some gamer subs. If you want a delicious sugar-free energy formula that gives you a nice peak for quite a while, very nice taper off, doesn't have a hard crash, comes in plenty of different delicious flavors, and you can get 10% off with my code Thorin at gamersubs.gg. Right, Droogbear says, you have oftentimes referenced philosophy, theology, or figures who dabble in the realms. Then he says he's listened to some live streams by some other people I'm not going to reference, where they dissect worldviews from an Orthodox perspective. I before would have aligned with a vague form of Christian beliefs with a draw to esoteric ideals like the Hermetic Principles or the works of Reverend Robert Taylor or Rudolf Steiner, but I am now leaning more towards Orthodoxy. Have you delved into Orthodoxy? And if so, have you come away with any opinions? I have found without a structured religion, it's hard to assume any oughts that can be reasonably enforced on society. Okay, there's a lot there. Right, I would say on the first part, I tend in general, like what I like about established traditions, or I mean in the occult they call them like magical currents essentially, or building off other people's work, or people in like mining a similar vein and adding to or adapting or tweaking what other people have done, is I think you can obviously, in theory, fast track how to get to more nuanced and advanced ideas. You're not actually building every brick and every plank and every initial aspect as you go up. You can sort of like see if they make sense, see if you understand the premises, go up through them, take the different concepts, build on top of each other like they do in philosophy. It's one of the reasons why starting at the end of philosophy with some guy, this is the ultimate guide, that you have to kind of know what he was referring to in some ways to know why what he's saying is interesting or revolutionary or actually makes sense. I'd say if you do that, then essentially in theory, you could then think from a higher level of one of those traditions, and then you could have your own ideas and your own interpretations that go on top of it. And I would just say you could get to a very, very interesting place. So I'm not against that, but to me, I tend to use that more as that's where I find the really interesting thinkers and really interesting ideas. And I tend in all areas to be more of a syncretist. I prefer to sort of take what I think works and what I think doesn't, I leave behind. I throw out the bathwater and I try and keep the baby. And then I try to build it into my own framework or my own conceptual path, I guess you could call it. So individual experience is probably a massive component for me. I do think, though, the problem is that only works for my own thoughts and my own conceptions of the world. On some level, in order to have community, I think there probably have to be certain elements that are shared. I think that's one of the reasons why modern day society just doesn't fundamentally work, does it? I think, yeah, essentially you have to have at least simple principles that you agree. And by the way, you can even interpret them very wildly differently. Someone could be quite a left-wing figure, and I could say to them, or an extreme right-wing figure or something, and I could just say something like, I care a lot about family and the safety of those I love, and providing a framework in which people can express themselves, but also don't oppress other people's. If you say these sorts of things, like actually, if you boil it down to the essence of the abstract like that, I think in theory, many people on different ends of the political and spiritual spectrum could agree with you. The point is, their idea of how to implement that, or what that actually means in practical terms, or even what they would support, or how they would express that in their own words, might be extremely different and seemingly mutually exclusive. So I do think you have to have some element of community, and I certainly think things like, I mean, it's as simple as a book club is community, right? We all like this author, or we all like to read these types of books. You don't have to all agree which book's the best or which part of the author you like the most, but if you can just agree upon that basis, you can have a book club. If you go to the gym, we're all agreeing to some degree health and fitness is important to us, right? Even if we have totally different goals, totally different ideas how to get there. One person might think using chemicals is good. One person might think you can only do it naturally. There's all sorts of different ways. So I think some things have to be shared. So as a result, religious traditions and spiritual traditions and philosophical traditions are going to have merit in that regard. I don't really see why, essentially, like in Counter-Strike, I can have very unique ideas that are uniquely mine and no one else agrees with. But in a general sense, if we were to put together a bunch of Counter-Strike journalists, on some level, we all like Counter-Strike or agree it's a good game or agree there are more things to discuss and we have a shared terminology and be able to discuss things with each other. So I don't think they're exclusive things. I think you can have a totally unique individual experience or perspective while also having like a more limited shared group experience in order to have things like community, a support network, people you can actually use as a sounding board, or people who have inputs and give you interesting ideas or thoughts that wouldn't be your own. I think that's actually essential, that latter part. I think way too much of philosophy and, quite frankly, the lives of young men is based, or even brilliant men or intense men, is based on the idea that they're just a lone wolf. And the problem is, like, the lone wolf obviously dies, doesn't he? So you can sort of be a lone wolf in certain areas, but in other senses, you need a pack, you need a group to roll with, you need people who you have their back and they have your back. I even think, by the way, as a man, you actually sometimes need to protect people, need to fight for people, need to make a space so that they can actually be able to express themselves. Obviously, again, this is why I said earlier, it all depends how you implement it. Like, obviously, what I just said there would be the justification of so many nutters being like, right, now you shut up and only let them talk. I'm not talking about that at all. That's not the my style at all. If you ever see my shows, I'm absolutely happy to let people get all their points off and explain them in as much detail as they want. I will absolutely disagree with many of the points, though. I might think they're even stupid or sometimes not worth stating in terms of I wouldn't bother. I think, as I say, the enforcement of these aspects is the bigger issue to me. But I certainly do think the idea, I mean, this is one of the reasons why things like icons of the Orthodox tradition or some of the architecture I find really beautiful, because that doesn't come from just one person alone. As far as I can tell, that is like an individual's genius or unique individual expression sublimated into and expressed through a lexicon and alphabet of a tradition already. So, for example, I mean, this is what essentially isn't a movie like Andrei Rublev about this, or you could say this is what Michelangelo was doing, or sometimes Leonardo da Vinci. Essentially, the premise is, it's like if someone paid you and said, right, you have to make me some sort of like Christian religious painting, but you were a genius visionary painter. You could do both. You could do a genius visionary painting, essentially, instead of it just being like the theme being an animal. So you chose Christianity as the theme and you expressed it through that. I'd also say, by the way, it's one of the reasons I actually think this will be a bit of a base take. I think like 80s cartoons for kids sometimes are phenomenal, and kids' movies from the 80s and early 90s, because I think, and comics from the 70s and 80s, is because those were people who, as far as I can tell, are brilliant creative minds. And they initially are limited by, like, you got to work with this, like, children's franchise, or you got to do a kids movie, or it's comics, it's just for kids, man. But they start putting in some of their own elements and expressing themselves and using the vehicle of this character and this tradition of what that character means to express ideas, to unpack nuanced aspects, to make complex and sometimes very poignant observations about life and the interaction, sometimes even of fiction and non-fiction. Even obviously people like Grant Morrison have explored those things, haven't they? So I think there is some interest in all these areas. There's interesting things in all these regards. I certainly don't think you should throw away tradition, and that would be quite silly in general. Although I also don't think you should think of it as factual. I don't think it even exists on that level. Like, I will always take into account, it's not just the solipsistic notion of like, did the universe exist before me? Did anything exist before me? Is there anything but my experience? I would say I do, though, always put a percentage on the chance that all history and all traditions beyond a certain point I think I can verify might just be made up, sometimes even whole cloth, or, I mean, again, it depends what your notions of time are. Maybe there's components where someone placed it there, or it was meant to spur a certain progress in a certain direction by people. Progress, obviously, being a very loaded term that doesn't always mean something positive. I would say that I have looked into people like the Reverend Robert Taylor and Rudolf Steiner. What I would say there is The Reverend Robert Taylor is someone where it's quite interesting esoteric ideas or interpretations of Christian belief, and especially how it would connect to, I mean, simple things like the realm you live in, what even the concept of a savior might be, these sorts of things. The only thing I would say is I find that sort of thinking, because he's coming specifically from both a Christian Orthodox, although not Eastern Orthodox in that sense, and I mean, just quite frankly, a Freemasonic perspective, if you look into it. As far as I can tell, all of those traditions no one ever gives away all the secrets, guys. That's a total myth. Even when people publish like rituals, you have no idea what those rituals mean and would symbolize and be like, even though you read them on the paper, because you didn't have the experiences that went along with them. You didn't have people to talk with and give you sort of lectures. There's always so much more. So as far as I can tell, all types of secret society, by definition, don't even just work on like exoteric and esoteric, or like esoteric inner circle. It's like there's always like concentric circles going in and in and in until eventually it's either like the person who made it or like the group that's going to go like even deeper, or they're all based on that as far as I can tell. So you never really get into like, this is what it's really about. Now, it's certainly interesting to see some of those ideas and ask what they could mean, and symbology could be translated or interpreted in a different manner. But I don't go too far there. I think there's some interesting ideas there. There's a lot of ideas that counter that or go against it from other traditions, though, and other even Christian and Freemasonic positions. So Rudolf Steiner, I mean, to me, that's like saying, have you ever read Nietzsche? It's like, well, yeah, I've read some Nietzsche and I've read some Rudolf Steiner, and some of it was good and some of it was interesting. But these are people they're autodidacts basically, right? And they have an incredibly wide breadth of topics they address. And even they syncretize different philosophies and traditions together. So it's not like, let's be real, it's not like reading a Discworld book or listening to a Ramones album where it's like, if you like one, you're probably going to like them all and you'll have an idea what they're like. Like, no, there's so many different areas in here. It's like, well, are we talking about early Nietzsche? We're talking about his political thinking, his religious thinking. Are we talking about Rudolf Steiner when it comes to like man and his consciousness? Are we talking about some of his ideas about what realm we live in and some of the more esoteric, let's say, like supernatural elements? Oh, there's so many different aspects of how should children be raised? What is the human being in the function of a society or a race or whatever? There's a million different angles you can go through. So I think there's interesting ideas. I'd say more on the Rudolf Steiner angle, but that's just based on the time that they're around. In terms of the ideas of orthodoxy, I've delved into it a bit. I think it's more something that, again, I just see as a touchstone. I like to go back to that and go, what do they actually say here? And what did the most brilliant minds say? Like, what did a Thomas Aquinas say or something like that? What were they thinking? These are the way I like to do it. But it's often still, I'm finding the individual that I'm interested in the tradition. It's not like, oh, the tradition, these are all the things I'm going to accept. Now, I will say, one of the things I do find tricky about this notion of having rules, essentially, and accepting things that you don't agree with is, it's different from like, do you have to believe it or not? It doesn't even have to be real or true to believe it or not. That's not even the way belief works. It works on a different scale completely, as far as I can tell. But the notion of like having rules you might not agree with, I think my issue is this. I, in a sense, have an anarchistic tendency that I don't really think that anyone can actually decide better for me what is right, wrong, or how things should be, which aren't even the same thing, or what would be the most practical solution. I just have found in life that doesn't ever seem to work out. It doesn't ever seem to make sense. But from my own life and my own, especially the last 3 or 4 years where I've really delved into self-discipline and trying certain things that even though I might not ultimately agree with some aspects of it, the results are seemingly the only way I've found to get the techniques required, get the results that I want, even if I don't necessarily like that that's the case. Certain things about how violence works in the world, or essentially times when maybe people should be gatekept or excluded from certain circumstances. I think that's part of the issue. So one of the things I would say is a lot of my earlier thinking before I became in any way almost like, I would say politically energized or activated in terms of how I thought and connecting it to like principles of how to live and what your philosophy is. I would say in that sense, a lot of my old version did always seem to come from some aspect of hedonism or selfishness or immaturity, in the sense that like, I didn't just want it to, you'll notice this is very common in the modern world. I didn't just want it to be that like, I want like a way to do X It's like, I also want the way to be one I approve of. I even aesthetically like it. It's the kind of person I like the personality of, I vibe with. They haven't done anything to sort of piss me off, and there shouldn't be any negatives along the way or price to pay sometimes. It should just be like ideal, and quite frankly, should is a word thrown out all the time. No one should be harmed. No one should get that way. You shouldn't do it. I often found that never goes anywhere. And part of the reason why is you are not willing to face not only a reality, but the notion that you can't always prejudge before you've done or tried something if it actually is what you thought it was. I'd say it's like some of those movies where I think a very cheap writing trick in movies is, it's basically how nearly all rom-coms work, you'll notice, is like you show an action or a statement by a character, but without a key piece of context. And then that becomes a massive drama that later on, the denouement of the film is, oh, that wasn't actually really what was going on. Like, for example, that wasn't a girl he was cheating on you with. That was his sister or his ex. Oh, wait, actually, you know what? Even though he appeared to be showing he didn't care, he was just trying to act cool to the guys, whereas actually he cares even more. And now he understands he has to make the ultimate sacrifice of overcoming public embarrassment and making it clear, you know, all that crap. Like, essentially, that can happen, I think, too often in those scenarios. And that's why self-deception and lying to yourself is actually one of the ultimate sins. And certainly not a damning one to the ends of the earth, but it's one that will stop you progressing more than almost anything else. Other people lying to you, other people attempting to arrest you, doesn't do it to that degree. I mean, unless they're literally mentally torturing you and signal jamming you and not letting you get your own thoughts off. I think it will always, even if you were in a prison cell, if you were able to be incredibly honest with yourself and look past what you want to be the case, I think certainly you could make incredible strides in these regards. And I agree, you can't really enforce it in a society. But then again, I actually do think society is completely inverted in terms of how it's conceptualized. Like the notion like it's a top-down set of ideas that come through everyone. No, as far as I can tell, society at its best is the individual coming from the grassroots to meet with the tradition, and then it's some sort of a conversation or a parlance between the two, or even a negotiation and a compromise, depending on what you value. So, for example, to me, the ideal society is the opposite to the one that's currently touted in the modern day and what is clearly being pushed towards, right? It's not a top-down sort of technocracy or autocracy with like little shared bits of power where you can have an opinion, or you can be part of the group shaming, or you can be like a mini fucking informant or fucking commissar against your neighbor or whatever. I would say it starts with the family. So it starts with like the husband and the wife, and then it has the child, and then it has the brothers and the sisters and the nieces and the nephews, and the uncles and the aunts, and the grandmother and the grandfather, and it goes out like that. And if these are able to like base in some sense their tree from a certain tradition with certain shared values, then they live in a community. This is why it doesn't work in the modern day, with other like-minded families of people who have a certain shared overlap, which becomes the grounds for the society or public square. And then beyond that, those communities are bunched together. Think of it like Game of Thrones, with like sort of a bannermen approach, like, cause ultimately we are like of the same, like, I mean, we have these shared aspects, maybe even genetically. Then you go beyond that to like, right, we agree to like protect each other and enforce certain things. And if we ever have to go for a bigger concept like a war, in theory, we'd be in it. And then if you could go further, I don't think it ever does really in history go beyond this, but in theory, you could have a whole state or a country. Like, I don't know that it works though. That's the problem. I only know that the family aspect works. That's why I sometimes think society is just a silly conceit to make it sound like you can take an aggregate of things, even though people only agree on the most abstract concepts, and then you're trying to actually implement them and then force everyone to do literally that practical thing. Henoda, you have talked before in your content about how in the modern world, we tend not to value our local cultures / communities. See a theme here? And you do not contribute what we can to make them better. I find myself agreeing a lot with this sentiment, and yet I still wish to move to another country in order to have new experiences and opportunities. But I feel conflicted about abandoning my home. As someone who has lived in a lot of different places, do you have similar feelings? How do you deal with them if you do? And if not, do you have any advice advice or perspective that could help someone be more at peace with this dilemma? Right. The real problem here, without sounding like I'm on some doomer black pill tip, is I don't think you actually have a choice. Don't think you have a choice, because if you just look at the way certain elements of enforcement interact with your life, or set social norms or whatever it is, or manipulate you and your neighbor, as it were, I actually don't know that what I had described in the answer before about making those communities works beyond you and your family. I know it could work there. You'd still have to block a lot of inputs or be very careful how they came in. I think it could work with a smaller community, maybe like 3, 4, 5, maybe we could go to 10 families. I think anywhere beyond that, I think you're already in a tough spot. And from some sort of a state or federal level, they're still going to attempt to impose certain things and fuck with you. But I get the vibe, maybe it might be possible to sort of do an Amish approach, basically. Beyond that, though, I don't think you actually can. Like, essentially, I mean, the joke is they're already making the other parts of the world, including some of the absolute worst parts of the world, part of what your country is. And they're, in doing so, removing your culture and your heritage and your ancestry. And spoiler, if you look at what they're doing with jobs and looking at what they're doing with education, look at some of these other things, they're sort of just removing you, aren't they? And they're just eventually just removing you and yours. So I don't really know that you can sort of stay and like beat back the tide, as it were. I do think still in life, you still in general can implement your values in the world. Like, I'll give you an example. Even though I live in the Netherlands now, which, by the way, is, because of the whole Going Dutch thing, it's an incredible country in terms of the sense of how they have just automatically, a little bit like Sweden, taken on ideas of things like feminist notions, right? So they will somewhat dispute certain gender role aspects. And so, for example, people here don't hold doors open for women. Now, I do in many circumstances, especially if I have time. Or especially if the woman is older than me, or seems like she's carrying something, or has a child. I do that, even though they won't reciprocate. They might not even really appreciate it. Someone might even get mad. I don't really give a fuck. It's who I am, not who they are. Now, I'll still do things like that. I will still always put my trash into a bin, my rubbish into a bin. It's bloody Americans in international English. I will always do that, even if everyone else has chucked theirs on the floor, even if, well, it's not my country, even if I'm not even going to live in that city. Because I still believe in the notion of, like, this is where I live. This is more how I would want things to be clean. This is my part in doing so. No, I'm not going to go and pick up everyone else's trash. And I'm not going to go and fight for people I don't know in scenarios where I'll get my head smashed in. And I'm certainly not going, essentially, like, I do think there are scenarios where, like, I might think a tiger is beautiful, but not in the context of if it was attacking my child, then I'll have to kill it, won't I? But at the same time, I also wouldn't intentionally go to where tigers are or stay where I know there will always be loads of tigers if that means they will get attacked and I'll have to kill them or be killed. There is a bit of back and forth in that regard. So I don't think you really have a choice, quite frankly. That's not a doomerist aspect. I'd just say, I think from my perspective, in the last 20 to 30 years, with whatever managed or organized collapse is going on in many regards, or reset or transmutation to something else, I would say probably the number one quality that will help get you through is probably adaptability. Like, if you have to have it the way things were before, I think that's why politically a lot of right-wing people are just lost and they don't know what to do or how to do it. They want to just go back in time. I think simply changing, like, it's all good, it's progress, like the left-wing people, that's also just a dead end. You're just chasing your own tail, then you'll be tricked into believing anything. But I think essentially you have to be able to do things like, well, for example, none of my ancestors would ever have worked like I do in content on a computer, right? Especially not in video, and like none of that would have existed. I had to adapt to some degree to be able to do those things, even though I also then honor my ancestors and their heritage and their tradition and try to bring certain aspects of essentially shared principles or aspects of how their lives were into my own life and make them active. I think it's possible we maybe never did have these lives or worlds, like I say in the answer before. I think some of it absolutely could be reverse engineered, that it was just done to make us think that was the case or to make us believe in a certain tradition that might not have actually been real on a like physical nuts and bolts level. That could be the case. I think the main reason to stay, in line with the previous answer, is family. Like, if you move to another country, this just shows sort of how atomized people are now. I think you actually will take for granted, because a lot of people already do when they already live there, that you won't see your family very often, and there won't be family gatherings. And also, you can't just do the everyday drop in, or you can't just pop it, oh, how are you doing? And see that, or see them about towns. You won't do that. And those actually are underrated, I think, for maintaining relationships, for having support networks, for having people who fight for you and you fight for them. I mean, I would also say one of the reasons why the answer isn't just go to the countryside, haul up, get your nice farm, and then like, lol, I win, and then everyone's going to shit in the cities is, if it gets bad enough in the cities, I'm not going full 2000 AD here, but eventually even the countryside aspects and communities could become like a wasteland, or could become areas where essentially roving bands or miscreants or criminals come and know they can isolate you and target you. I mean, in this sense, I'd maybe say, to know that it's not the ultimate solution, I would say maybe go and look at things like the Boer War, or times where, like, of the Bannerman type eras that they're aping in Game of Thrones, of when people had certain communities or certain small states, and then the fact that ultimately they still can, from the control structure from Babylon, come and fuck with you to some degree. So it's tricky. I feel like maybe at times you want to live in a city or near a city or in a smaller town. At times, maybe the countryside would be the better one. I just think essentially, this is why I wonder if there ever was these hundreds of years that people talk about, where it's like, and then he was just a fisherman, and then here's someone's a fisherman. Like, I do think, by the way, to answer the question before, that's also why certain levels of orthodoxy are brilliant, because you can pass on and very quickly level up someone below you as a protege, your son or your nephew or whatever, daughter, in a way that you can't do in the same way as if someone formalized goes and they're just being paid to teach you, or you have to ask them, or they just have to copy an idea without understanding how it works and having the master there to guide them. I think there's some elements of that. So, yeah, I think I've said what I can on that one. I would also say, yeah, new experiences and opportunities are good, but why do you have to have them by living there? That's what I would say. Like, I lived in Korea for like a year and a half, 2 years. Like, maybe do that. I wouldn't say put down roots there and that's just where you live. Because again, another thing is, by the way, despite what they'll tell you in the West, if you go to Korea, China, you never will be Chinese. You'll never truly be part of Chinese culture and society. And I actually don't think I want to be, or that would even be a reasonable outcome to expect or hope for. I don't think it's a sensible desire. If anything, like you say, maybe you want new experiences and new opportunities. I mean, you can have those for a month. You can have a holiday. You can have 3 months. You can take a sabbatical year. You can go somewhere, stay for a couple of years to have the experiences. And then wouldn't the cool thing be go back, reconnect with all your tradition, your heritage, your family, and bring some of those cool aspects in there and have a support network? I think it's not either or. It's both and, isn't it? PP Nomula. Is there any form of media you could recommend to digest, read, listen, watch before reading the Bible? I want to attempt to read the Bible, but I haven't read any book of that stature before. Something like Dante's Inferno. Basically, first of all, I would just say this. Don't ever read in a way where it's a chore or you're forcing yourself to. Find things that when you start to read them, it's almost like they're almost addictive. You just want to read more. It's a delight to read more. You almost get annoyed when you get tired and you have to stop reading it. So I would say, don't just start reading the Bible on page 1. I'd say ask yourself, what are you into? Like, if you're really interested in the story of Jesus, go straight to the best Gospels and start reading those. If you're interested in, like, poetry or imagery, go and read, like, Proverbs or Psalms or the Song of Solomon or something like that. If you're interested in, like, revelatory material, go read Revelations, go read, like, Isaiah and Ezekiel. If you're interested for some reason in, like, the ancient Hebrews and how they structured their society, go read, like, like Deuteronomy. And, like, I mean, the joke is I wouldn't read Leviticus, but you could read Leviticus too. Yeah, you get the point. I would say sometimes you're not even going to get what you want out of the Bible, as in you might be into, like, William Blake's art, or, like you say, Dante's Inferno, or maybe I mean, in theory, even like the Master and Margarita, these are all, like, referential to Christianity. But what you might find is you don't really like the original source material that inspired those works. Like, for example, people know from this channel, I very much like the drum and bass work of TB, the Norwegian drum and bass producer. And he will often reference, like, certain jazz or, like, funk records or like certain types of hip hop that I actually don't vibe with at all when I go back and listen to. Like, I can't even almost see how it came through what he did. I can sort of, in a way. I actually find that quite often with influences. It's how I know the individual themselves did something special, transmuting what those were into something else. That's why, for example, I'll probably do a video about this one day. It's why people tell me, no, Gallagher just plays your edge, that riff. It's like, yeah, but look what he did with it. I think he did something better with it. I prefer this one to that. I actually prefer Led Zeppelin's work to the original blues tunes they ripped off or took the name off. So I would say I don't really have that many things to suggest. Like, I would just say this. When you read the Bible, you're not reading a story. It's not a plot. It's not even really like characters. Again, it's a spiritual tradition. It's like archetypes. It's ideas of higher nature, perhaps. I would say the main key, it's a bit like how I say to watch Andrei Tarkovsky movies, is contemplation and reflection. Just think about it a lot. And there is a book I could say maybe you could get that could help you get into it, which is there's a book called The Orthodox Study Bible, and that's pretty interesting. I think it'll give you some interesting thoughts. And as ever, find people you're interested to have their own interpretations and thoughts on it, and then be bold enough to have your own. And to say if something doesn't make sense to you, you can either cast it aside or you can go and hunt and find why doesn't it make sense to me. Don't just say, I must accept what they say. This is what he meant to say. I hate that whole way of thinking. Bar Ado Mushroom says, what is the difference between a dynamic duo and a dynastic duo? And then he's put hip-hop, music duos, commentary, podcasts more specifically. I don't actually really understand what you're asking there. Like, this is an example of a question where that first question is fine. If you then follow up with, I would define a dynastic duo as X or Y. What about, like, I don't really know what he means there. Like, dynamic duo to me, like, this is just semantics, Fadgal. Dynamic duo to me is just a silly marketing cliche that is spammed over and over again anytime two people are a good duo. To me, dynamic would be, it's to do with the dynamic between them. Like, they have a fantastic connection with each other. So, what would even be the examples of that? Because here's the problem. I can't really just do, like, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, because as far as I can tell, they didn't actually write together that much. And also, if you know about certain think tanks, what did they write? But obviously there are musicians that have been like, I mean, I would say maybe you could say on some level like John Romero and John Carmack, if you go and watch the interview I did on my channel with the guy who wrote Masters of Doom, or you know about that history, like one of them had a certain vision for imagery and ideas, and the other one was more like the hard tech and the coding, and without each other their games were never close to as good. The John Carmack games are just an amazing engine with diminishing returns and a worse like actual story, interesting elements. The guns are less interesting. Romero has all the brilliant ideas, but everything's a bloody flawed gem. Everything doesn't quite come out coded as well as it needs to be. It doesn't ever quite live up to what you hope it'll be. Can't reach the grand scales. Like, I actually think the real tragedy is that's some like Shaq Kobe shit where they should have stayed together for another 10, 20 years. They could really have blown this industry apart. Dynastic duo, I don't know. Does that mean you just had a lot of success together? Like it lasted a long time? Don't really know. Don't really know on that one. So maybe ask it again with more detail or give me some clues. I can't, that is inscrutable to me, I'm afraid. Umzi, thank you for your advice and guidance on my spiritual journey through your videos and content. I remember when you talked about intuition in an AMA on your main channel, and it really resonated with me. I realized how disconnected I was from intuition throughout my life. My question is, how do you connect to intuition? I struggle to differentiate between the voice of intuition and the voice of trauma. Also, what small day-to-day things have helped you to raise your consciousness and stay more in tune and connected? Right? When you say like voice of trauma, to me, the idea of trauma, without trying to go on like a nuts and bolts of the brain with it, it seems to be the idea that somewhere within your mind, your brain, your consciousness, it's the notion that when something really terrible happens that overwhelms you, the mind almost protects you and sort of encloses that off. Can I call it like a tumor or something? And the notion is it encloses it off to stop it just constantly permeating and wrecking you. I mean, this is where you'd have to go into ideas of consciousness, like the idea that on some level, everything that happens to you always was, always is, and always and will always happen to us. Like, it's like there is no time in that sense. We're just experiencing it differently. So if you can allow your mind to go back to the point of the trauma and then you re-experience it like through your consciousness and you think of all the thought and then you glide into it, it's like watching a brilliant Christopher Nolan movie like Memento or The Prestige. You know what's going to happen, but you still experience the emotions and the feelings and the heartache and the success and the triumph and the confusion all again when you go through it again, like you were playing through a movie. But you still feel it, even though you know the characters can't make the different choices. Why things like predestination or are very deterministic thing are very interesting ideas, even though I don't necessarily subscribe to them. But then again, maybe I can't because I'm within the movie, as it were. I would say one of the problems is this. When people go, I think people overemphasize trauma and they do it intentionally. I'll just say this. Let's say we talked about trauma on a societal or a racial or even a personal level. I think some of the things in movies and media are to intentionally stimulate a re-experiencing. Sometimes experiencing for the first time as something you think is your trauma based on your past heritage or things you were told happened to people in the past. And then you experience it because of seeing the media over and over again. People think it's just a movie, it's not real. It's that your mind doesn't seem to know that. Like, actually, the way we experience things like that, I would say sometimes your internal landscape is more real to you than your external landscape. So I actually think constantly reminding or prodding people about these things or inflaming them is done intentionally to make people constantly essentially be like cutting open, I'll just use the analogy, like the tumor and having all the shit just flow out and wreck all of you. Again, I'm not on some like super medical tips. It's an analogy, isn't it? It's a metaphor. I would say essentially that's done intentionally to open up a new wound and stop it from healing at any point. I actually think that's why they do it in certain scenarios. Like, think about certain countries that were at war, in theory within some people's lifetime still, that now there's no resentment between people from those countries largely. People don't hate people from those countries if they migrate between them. They actually might even have shared values. They might even consider we stick up, we're even allies now. That's in the countries where they intentionally haven't bombarded them with these aspects of like, but remember this, prod, remember this. Oh, see that guy there? He's like the ones who did, he's like the ones who did that to your family and your people and your thing. That's basically you, right? You're experiencing it again. What about this? Remember the worst things. And then you look at the things where they do that with, and there are people now who live today who actually themselves are very, very, very far back connected with anyone who experienced that. They've never in any context experienced that now, but they feel as though they have. And the person they're blaming, sometimes even their ancestor didn't do or wasn't involved with any of that stuff. Like when they do about certain skin colors, etc., sometimes that person is like from Bulgaria and they emigrated years after what you're talking about, or after this war, and you're thinking of them because they're the same skin color that they're somehow related to. It's nonsense. I mean, I once saw an image that just said, I won't say the other part, but I'll say this. It just said, like, it showed a little Japanese girl now, like a 6-year-old Japanese girl. It just said, like, would you blame her for Pearl Harbor? And obviously you look at that and you go, well, of course, that'd be absurd. But that's absolutely what certain people's political movements, religious movements, spiritual movements, propagandas, political parties, it's absolutely what they want you to do today. So to me, the trauma angle, I think people go a bit too far from. I think essentially, sometimes it's probably healthy to process trauma or whatever. Sometimes it probably should be left in the past. You should probably focus on building a better future, as it were. Like one of my philosophies in life is, I don't as much mind that bad things happened before. I'm going to make sure they don't happen now, and I'm going to build a better future now. That's a key thing for me. So I don't mind making mistakes or learning things late. I don't care about any of that shit. Then I'd say there's the whole thing that one of the biggest things with intuition is this. The reason you have to learn a level of self-mastery, that might be over things like what your relationship to sexuality is, like how you express it. That might be how much input you take from certain areas. That might be something as simple as what your relationship to food is, or to exercise, or to movement, or to travel is, or to making money, or to essentially, desires, temptations. I think you have to be able to separate temptations and desires from intuition. I think most people are only tuned to desire, to very simple inputs that just stimulate immediately in the short term. And that as a result, a part of your mind, again, if you want to use the model, it'd be like the lizard brain or something. Yeah, give me that, give me the sugar, jerk off, look at the woman. Just put off what you want to do. Just do something that you think is fun and distracting. I would say there's that aspect. So in terms of what things I've done to try and help me, I don't know about raise my consciousness, just stay more in tune and connected. Mindfulness in general in life is a massive one for me. this is one thing I've learned from like Christian monks, like Buddhists, etc., is the notion that they said to be present. I would just say, if you say focus, people are like, all right, bloody hell. It's more like, don't be distracted when you eat food. Enjoy the flavors. Think of the presentation. Think of the effort that went into making it, or the relationship between you and the person. Did they do it because they love you? Did they do it to provide for you? Did they do it to save you time cooking? So think of these things when you go for a walk. Take in the sights and the sounds. Experience them anew. When you have a shower even. Don't just only ever be doing the shower thoughts and off elsewhere. Focus on ideas like the feeling of warmth, the feeling of being in a body, different aspects of it. Yeah, there's all sorts of things. I think when you do that, I think it will just naturally, you will find joy in moments and in life, and you will have a sense of gratitude that you otherwise may not, especially if you're someone who's totally perverted into just dopaminic circuits and pleasure and desire. I think in general, a great piece of advice from a long time ago was Joseph Campbell's advice, where he said that everyone should have a room that they go into. I mean, I think he had it as like a set time, but just for like, say, an hour or two each day. And in that room, they do essentially, if I say whatever they want, an idiot's going to go, so they kill people and take drugs. No. As in, they go in there and they do something like, they do poetry if they're interested in that. They do some art and painting or line drawing. They go in there and they write a book. They go in there and maybe they have, some sort of a magical or spiritual tradition they engage in. Maybe they go in there and they meditate. Maybe they go in there and they reflect on life. They could be doing all sorts of things. But the idea is you have a place away from other things, a set area that you almost sacralize and make, this is the place I go and do that. And the idea is by doing it each day, you're going to make it a habit that builds up, and eventually it will even become pleasurable and maybe even eventually necessary to go and do that. And that will be one of the manners in which you can connect to ideas of intuition. It's a lifetime's journey, isn't it? I wouldn't claim to have mastered any of these things. Novello says, if you could get 10 minutes with yourself when you were 25, what would you say? And do you think you would listen/understand the advice? Like, the only problem with this question is it's a very, very cliched question. And I don't really know that it ever really gets interesting answers, because everyone successful, you'll notice, pretty much just says, like, I wouldn't really tell them anything, because they know that it's like a butterfly effect chain of events where if they change even one, they might never get to the success of the person they are now. So if they like the success they have now and the person they are now and the skill set they have now, they don't really want to tweak anything. You'll notice a lot of like regret is people who've lost, people who have failed, people who will never get another chance to try and do those things. That's why I actually think it's very misplaced. If I was an eco in CSGO, I wouldn't have that much regret for you. What I would try and do is learn the lessons from them and make sure I win in the future. And then when I win in the future, am I really going to give a shit about that? Like, does Device really care that much still about the 2015 majors? He's won 4 majors. I don't know that he does. I think he's pretty at peace with where he is now. And actually, he'd like to win more majors, but he's not winning more majors because he lost the other ones, if you know what I mean. He understands those were lessons, and that's why he became the master of winning majors. I also think on some level, life's not that serious. Life really can be boiled down to like chop wood, carry water, feed yourself and those around you, express love, conversate, be mindful, be grateful, build something, express yourself. A lot of it is pretty simple. I think people get caught up in all this nonsense. So the idea, if I had 10 minutes, what would I say? The joke is, I don't think I would say anything. If anything, I would maybe just go and say something like, you'll find a way to figure it out. Understand that you can be wrong and become less wrong later. I don't really know that I'd say much. I don't really know what people actually hope you're going to... As far as I can tell, isn't that secretly like they either want me to admit I did a bunch of things wrong, which is just a bit of sort of almost like gossipy pornography, or you're 25 and you just want me to tell you what you should do differently. Maybe it's that. I don't really know. So I don't know. I don't think I'd do much different, quite frankly. Droog Bear. Have you ever looked into, let me see, This is actually a very similar question to the one before, so maybe you asked it in two places, but I'll ask it anyway. Have you ever looked into the Reverend Robert Taylor or Rudolf Steiner? Answered that. I lean towards their beliefs, but I struggle with the question if an individual can interpret the supernatural. What happens when two individuals use the same text and get a contradictory belief? Contradictory belief. See, this is again where I think rationality and facts and logic have actually ruined areas where they're not applicable. Like the idea beliefs can contradict each other. I think actually almost every human contains within them contradictory beliefs. They just choose which to sort of inhabit or bring to the forefront at different times. That's one of the things that makes like so much political hypocrisy. Not really that hypocritical, really. There's a difference between facts and things that logically either make sense or don't. They can contradict. But I do think, like when you say it, an individual can interpret, they can interpret it to a degree of their own satisfaction and judgment. I don't know if they can. Like when you say interpret, maybe you can only experience supernatural things. Maybe when you interpret, you're talking about things like either doing an imaginative expression of it or rationalizing or characterizing or modeling it. Maybe certain things like that can't be. Maybe in doing so, you lose something of it. In the same way as if you adapt a book into a movie, you can try as much as you want to be faithful and show certain things, but it'll never be the book because it's a movie and the medium's different and the structure's different and the form is different. So when you say two individuals use the same text and get contradictory beliefs, I don't have a problem with that, really. Then he says, most people's reaction to the problem, apparently it's a problem, is to submit that authority to a church/religion. However, a lot of them have proven unworthy stewards, in my opinion. I would love to know where you stand on this. Okay. Right. In terms of the idea of like unworthy stewards, if you go high up enough in chains of power, by definition that happens in part because I think there are certain forces and people in the world and groups who intentionally will not allow certain power structures to go beyond a certain local level, and they will absolutely infiltrate their agents. They will take over these things. They will change these things to be perverted to what they wanted or what they want expressed or what they want you to think. I think that will always happen, and I don't actually know if you can totally beat that. Don't know if you can. I think that might just be a certain level. It's why I don't look to like massive states and continents, and I don't think of these things in terms of solutions. I think they're almost the opposite of solutions. So in terms of the idea that you like submit to the authority, I don't know that I submit in the sense like, in a sense, someone has to have authority if you're like leading a group in a practical exercise. There has to be some level of this is the leader and you can choose later or you can opt out. But if you're going to do it, they're going to sort of lead in a way. Yeah, there's that element, but the idea that they don't have total control over all of it. So I would say one of the things is, this is where you have to essentially ask yourself, are you at heart like an anarchist in that sense? Because if the leader has to be perfect or without any flaw or something that doesn't jive with you, then you, by definition, can't have a leader. In fact, the only leader you can have is yourself. And even then, you're going to have to constantly work on yourself. So, and even then, you could only lead yourself, because how could you lead anyone else? Because surely then they would see a flaw or something that didn't quite work with you or somewhere where your authority didn't apply, etc. I don't really know if there is like universal truth in the sense that some people think. Like, I do think there are sort of conclusions that people will come to via the same paths. There are certain aspects of reality appear to be universal. But in terms of I don't think there are a subjective truth, but I do think what people call truth is their subjective interpretation of truth. I do think there might be hard truths. I don't know if humans can entirely access them, or if they can do more than experience them or get a glimpse at them. If like essentially one of the things I found actually quite revolutionary about the work of like H.P. Lovecraft or Philip K. Dick is the notion of like, maybe you can only go so far into like, maybe like understanding pure truth isn't the ultimate ideal. Maybe it's not even possible. Maybe even to experience that would send you to other people mad, and therefore wouldn't have much function in the world. I mean, that sort of built into the notion of the outsider by Colin Wilson, and the notion of like Indian sages who go into the forest and just live there thinking about like whatever Hinduism or whatever the fuck it is. So, I mean, the other thing here is you're sort of asking me for the ultimate answers. Like, I haven't got them yet. I don't even know if there are ultimate answers. I mean, that's why a lot of spiritual traditions, I notice, build in the idea that you get to come back and have another life, or you have another go at it, or you'll learn certain lessons, or maybe lessons passed genetically through you to your heritage and should have a family. That's why I think they build a lot of those ideas into it. I won't read this name. As someone with eclectic tastes, in particular in literature, have you ever considered learning another language? Or read, I think he means. If not, why? If you were to learn a language or another one, which would it be? Yeah, I'd like to. I've just never really had what for me was a good reason to do it. Like none of the places I've lived where I ever need another language. I think in the future I might have one. Though, like the obvious one would be to experience their culture and their literature through that language, like to talk to them, to be able to read their best works without it being interpreted through someone else. That would obviously be a big boon. So I think the obvious one to me would be something like Russian. I think there's a long heritage and tradition there that would be very interesting to get into. Just some of my favorite authors and even artists. French is quite an interesting one because of the comics industry essentially there. That has nothing to do with Marvel and DC. Their own heritage of comics. They've got a lot that have just never been translated or only amateur translations, and that would be very interesting. I'm not particularly a fan of French culture or the French. Dutch, in the sense I live here, and it's almost polite to some degree to know some of the local language, and also, again, to understand certain things about how people think. I do think you sometimes have to understand their language. The crucial one, I think, as an obvious one, would be if you have children, and you don't live in your home country, or in this case, England or America or Australia, then I think it would only make sense to also learn the language, both to interact with them in it and to help them, and they can also help you as they learn it. I think there'd just be a lot of good reasons to do it in that sense. Panda says, hugely appreciate the latest answer, as it did synchronistically unlock way more than it may have intended. And in reviewing past experiences of myself, without no major intent beyond having fun, please others remember, then he's saying, please others remember to heed Thorin's warnings, or at least try to have fun. You mentioned having read up a few books on body language. Would you mind maybe sharing some of these you feel you have found a lot of insight in? I have a tendency to be way too embracive. If you have anything that may help me find how to notice bad habits within myself or question, I maybe should work on picking up from others' discomfort. Okay. The main book I would say, just as a starter, and beyond that, I think you just have to find your own way. Like you could try reading books about hypnosis, or you could try learning about concepts like non-verbal communication. And you can try doing things like watching a speech back that moved you in a certain way, and then watch it back or watch another speech by the person you haven't even heard and turn off the sound and see how what they're doing reacts. And if you have even if you can sort of get, I almost know what he's saying here, or I can see, I wonder if he's feeling that way. And then you turn it on and you go back and listen and you go, actually that would actually, I think, help you clue into a few things. I would also say the book I often recommend is a book by like a former FBI profiler called What Everybody Is Saying by Joe Navarro. A lot of people in the poker world got into that. By the way, learning to be a live cash table poker player would be a very good way to learn some of these things, looking for people's tells, looking for how they act, looking for patterns of behavior. I mean, look, just to excite you, I don't know how much you can take from it. There was a show called like Lie to Me, which had like a very interesting plot like this, which if you just go and look up, it's a TV show from like, 10 years ago now or something. If you go look it up, that has like some ideas in that could at least like give you a notion of what is possible, even though it's quite an extreme example of it because it's fictional. In terms of like the idea of some of these things about how you sort of figure out body language, the main thing here is don't hyper focus on what they are feeling or saying. I would say don't be very selfish or very greedy, because then you're going to be too much within your own desires and your own thoughts in a way. Like one of the reasons I'm very good at interviews is I already know how to ask questions and how to ask follow-up questions, and I have a very good memory. So I'm not obsessing while they're talking about what I'm going to say, what I'm going to ask. That will actually naturally come out of me because of my thousands and thousands of interviews and hours put into this. I've mastered certain aspects of it. I'm listening to what they're saying and what that implies and what their philosophy is and what principles are at play here and what that might infer about something else. And therefore, then when I go to ask a question, there are so many things to choose from. So if you're too obsessed with yourself and your experience while looking at the other person, you're going to have a very hard time interpreting or intuiting what they're doing or reverse engineering it. I would say, in terms of the idea like you being too embracive, I think there's a key thing built into what I'm saying, which is don't hyper focus on what you are feeling in the moment. Don't be overly selfish or greedy. Like the way this is expressed in philosophy or religion is like, let the flower exist and take in its beauty and enjoy it in that moment without being greedy and picking it off and clutching it and killing it and like crushing it and then opening your hand and having nothing there. Taste the honey, experience it, taste flavors without drowning yourself in the whole pot of honey and overdoing it. Give other people some space, I would say. Add to what they're doing, try and give value to them, compliment them in ways that are genuine. I can compliment anyone pretty much in a way that's genuine. I never have to lie. And then I would also say, in terms of some things like you being way too embracive, I would say a lot of that comes out of desperation. Like this is where actually movies and songs often actually fuck with men in terms of what they think your expectations should be romantically or in your life. Because what they try to make you believe is like, and she's the one and you're going to lose everything. You have to just give everything and sublimate every aspect of you, yourself, your desires, what you want, everything in your life, just into her and what she wants and just pray at the eternal fucking feminine, the tyrannical. No, that's going to fuck you. And that I think comes from desperation. So I would say on some level, take it less seriously, get out there, sort of have, it doesn't have to be like promiscuity. You can have simple relationships, have female friends, have conversations with them, and therefore you can actually act from more of a place of abundance when you meet someone. You can actually, without doing it overly rationally, you can get more of a sense of like, right, I'm sort of vibing with something, but there's some massive red flags here that are making it seem like I might have a really bad experience if I overly commit now. And also, you just won't be as desperate, will you? Like, you're not meeting someone and really knowing like you should be with them. Like you've overthought that in that sense. That you have to meet them a bunch of times. You have to have a bunch of experience. You have to go a bunch of things. It builds up. There's a natural component to it once you get out of your own way. And I would also just say generally, find your own shit in every sense. Figure out yourself. Don't ask people to spoon feed you. Figure out how to feed yourself. In this analogy, hunt for yourself, change your methods, adopt new ones. That is the quest of life, isn't it? Santiago Lafaga says, these days, there is a general sense in mainstream society that we are more advanced in every way than any people of the past or any age before our own. Personally, as a lover of a few different arts, especially music, it seems the modern output often pales in comparison to the past. This is despite the tools needed to learn these arts being easily accessible with the help of the internet. And let's not forget technological advances, which make creating art all the easier. What do you think are the biggest ways we have regressed? Why does the modern person often have this newer is always better mentality? Is it simply people's desire to believe in continual progress or something bigger at play? Right? There's so much here. I can't do a 4-hour video. This might be its own video one day. Maybe I'll put it in the poll. So I would say this. We'll just start at the beginning. Like the idea that we've advanced in every way more than people, I think that's just stupid. I think it's given to you by the control system because they want you to believe you're next level and you're the shit. And they want you to believe stuff like, because someone gave you a calculator, you're smarter than someone who invented like methods of calculation without a calculator and could do it in his head or just on a piece of paper in a way you can't. I mean, by definition, you aren't. You are just stood on the back of a technological progress or technological device. And in fact, how has it progressed to you? The technology's progressed, but you haven't progressed. You've regressed as a human. You can't do what's happened there. In fact, all technological advances, I notice, take away from the human and what the human's capable of and reduce his skill set. Like when you say it makes it easier to create art, I would say it makes it easier to create a simulacra of art, what looks like art in a cargo cult sense. I could actually argue it makes it harder because in some senses, like necessity is the mother of invention. Sometimes actually the necessity of having to get very good at an instrument or to be able to hear and pick out fine notes and differences, that skill set built up is then what enables you to create extremely transcendent art. Then also, this is something that Terence McKenna talked about a lot. Essentially, people worship techne, the idea that technology is the ultimate progress, even if it comes at the cost of spiritual progress, or regression in this regard is what the price is. Emotional regression, like dehumanization, all these elements. So in terms of like the notion, what are the biggest ways? I mean, the obvious ones you touched on a bit yourself is in the arts, like old art and architecture wasn't made by people who we were told, as far as I can tell. And especially in certain cases, wasn't made by us. And that's all I'll say on that one. So there's one mystery I think I've sort of semi-solved. I think modern incentives intentionally don't want great art because of the effect it has on people. Like an amazing stained glass window. What if even the beauty of the stained glass window was a distraction from what the window was when it wasn't a window and didn't have glass in it? What the architecture represented? What it was many, many centuries ago in a different world when the realm was different? What if people fund and fuel degenerously intentionally to shift your social norms, make you think certain things are cool, or that you like a certain aesthetic, even though it might imply something quite negative about you, and just actually bring you into a state of consciousness you don't enjoy? I would just say look into that. And I would also say just ignore a lot of that stuff and live a life free from it where possible. I think we've regressed in terms of things like manners, in terms of the concept of self-teaching, in terms of courage. I think a lot of history is nonsense, and I don't think you're actually trapped in your age in the way they tell you are. Anytime they have to put billions of dollars and loads of man-hours and full spectrum approach to telling you something must be true, and it is the only way it could ever be, that's almost a hint that it isn't. That's why they have to keep pumping it in your brain constantly from day one, and then enforcing it through all your social connections. I think the idea that newer is always better is just stupid. It's an arrogance. It plays into a narcissism. Of course I'm the best. Like the Joe Rogan thing of sort of like, they didn't even have shoes. It's like, bro, what the fuck are you talking about? Yeah, and you know what? They didn't take in certain poisonous chemicals because some idiot in a white lab coat told them, take it, it's good. And you're like, oh, I'm dying. What's going on? People before must all have died like this when they didn't even take the chemicals because no bloke told them to. You know what I mean? Like that is so feckless to me. It's like, it's why people are so silly when the ultimate one for Americans is like, USA is the best, or the guy from my country has to be the best at this. Like, it's essentially a vicarious way of like feeling it you experienced, like dominating, being successful, mastery, excellence, but you didn't. You just got like a fake, vicarious little, almost like, you just got a contact high, as it were. You didn't get the real thing. I also think people need to believe that ancestors, people they care about, died and lived for a purpose. I mean, I don't say like they need to and it's wrong. I think people need that. And so as a result, this is what is supplied to you. You want to believe they didn't die in vain, whatever that means. They're dead now anyway. You can't wind the clock back. So it's a way to sort of like soothe you. It's like, oh, it had to happen that way. Or it was the right thing, even though they died. That's why I always say one of the biggest like piece of NLP, so psyops, I think, is that notion of like, I'll die for my country. It's like, that's the absolute bottom of my list, mate. I would kill potentially for my family and people I care about and myself sometimes. Would I die for those? I mean, if forced to. And I don't think it's as simple. Like, they are actually essentially, I think, building in an idea of like almost dying is the highest ideal and sacrifice in the most literal sense is the ultimate. It can be, but I also think in some ways that leads to a victim mindset in a way and a forced helplessness and encourages you to throw your life away. I think there are also in technology specific, just like technology itself, it's a very specific vertical. It's not a very horizontal approach, and it's definitely not holistic. Like the ultimate thing I would say about a lot of, let's just say chemical things that go on in the world is they intentionally isolate something and make a synthetic version of it because when it exists in nature, it comes with all these other chemicals that are complementary and offset it and sometimes safeguard it and give you other benefits or even give you part of the benefits you didn't understand. And somehow when it's made synthetically, sometimes it doesn't work the same way. And also you don't have the same sort of trial group of all your ancestors who took it and didn't necessarily go mad or kill themselves or do some crazy shit, do they? There's also the religious impulse. People need to sort of believe things are improving, or even if they're regressing, it's heading towards a reckoning. That's a very strong desire in people. Some people would say it's because the reckoning will be maybe when your own life ends at some point in time. So it's a natural thing, a consideration you might have. I think this is one, like I say, maybe this is a poll question that I do a much, much bigger one on. Yeah, I think that's probably the right one. Air Delossi says, imagine that you're having a dream As with most dreams, the premise of this dream is something you'll accept without a desire for evidence or rationality. If gravity becomes repulsive or time stands still, a dreamer such as yourself will simply consider these situations as normal, as if apples have always fallen up and frisbees have always hovered stationary over the grass. This dream is no different. You're approached by a man who is a prophet. Why is he a prophet? Because in your dream, he simply is. And you know that he has direct access to the ground of reality / God / the cosmic order, the unbegotten thought, etc. He begins talking to you about gibberish, but you can cut him off and make a demand. You ask him to start from the beginning, to explain the universe from first principles, its starting point, its deepest nature, and to elaborate until the present moment. We can call his answer the cosmic formulation. For example, in the cosmic formulation of Christianity, it is that there is a God. He made the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. He gave us a garden, but we botched our chance at eternal utopia through a desire for subversion, so on and so forth. Which answer of the prophet would disturb you the most? What cosmic formulation would unsettle you and keep you up at night? On the flip side, which answer would bring you the most joy, the most peace? Right, I'll just go through a bunch of this and unpack how I think about it. So the idea that I'm having a dream and I will always just accept whatever happens in the dream without a desire for evidence or rationality. Now, I don't know about evidence or rationality, because again, I think belief is a different thing than evidence and rationality. It's why science, as presented to you, is bunkum. Like, science has no conclusions. Humans have conclusions based on on scientific experiments or principles, but they will always just be human interpretations. So when he says, if gravity becomes repulsive, you will just simply consider it. I think he's saying that that's how dreams work. Now, I don't experience it that way. I've many times in dreams thought things like, but that person couldn't be in my life now, or that person is dead, or I've never met this person, or that's not actually correct, or this doesn't make sense. Like, actually, why would this work this way? I've had that thought in the dream while still being in the dream, and also sometimes while not being lucid. Sometimes it has caused me to become lucid. You can't even become lucid in dreams, as far as I can tell, so maybe that goes a bit against that. There's a lot of books out there on lucid dreaming. But let's say, to accept his premise. So in this one, this guy comes to me and somehow he just has all the answers, right? Well, first of all, it's already like a fictional conceit there, isn't it? I'm already in a movie in a way there, because could anything like that ever exist? Like, can humans even comprehend these ultimate truths? And not that I'm saying humans are just like an ape and nothing. No, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying I think it would be such a subjective personal experience. I don't think you can ever fully communicate to someone else. So then the notion of what would disturb me the most, I mean, the obvious answer is sort of like a Chaos Gods and Warhammer 40k / H.P. Lovecraft type scenario. Like, it's one that you'll notice very few people subscribe to in terms of their religion. The notion like there is a God or an entity or a force. It's either indifferent, which is not that bad, or it's actively hostile and malicious and maybe even revels in pain, domination, and just wrecking you and you getting fuck all. That's a pretty horrible idea, right, to contemplate and to think is the case. Even though, if you know my mentality and like sort of my never say die attitude, I could still continue on and find happiness and carve it out and battle and all the rest of it. Like, I like that famous, I think it's Indian philosophy, where it's like the guy who's being chased by, I can't remember if he's being chased by, we'll make it one and the other. So he's being chased by a wolf at the top of a mountain and he falls off the edge and he grabs and he just happens to hold onto a branch. And then he's holding on the branch. And let's say even the branch is starting to crack a little bit and starting to pull. He can't let go because he drops down and there's a tiger down there. So if he tries to climb back up, wolf kills him. If he tries to go down, the tiger kills him. And eventually, maybe even this branch will snap and it'll come out the side, whatever. But then he notices on the branch a little strawberry. Now, I kind of subscribe to the philosophy of, in that moment, not because it's about desire, because it's about finding something you can actually embrace, be in the moment with, be grateful for. You just eat the strawberry. You just eat the strawberry. The rest of it you don't have much choice in, but you can eat the strawberry, can't you? So that's something I do think about. So I could still continue on even in the face of that sort of thing. That's why I don't seem to have the same difficulty with the certain types of ideas that seem to be very upsetting to other people. Then in terms of the idea of like, other disturbing ideas, I mean, an obvious one would actually be what I think they're trying to reverse engineer with modern things, like where they tell you, I mean, I haven't said it in my own videos, you're just a speck of dirt on like a planet in a giant cold, empty universe that will one day die of heat death and then explode into nothing and all be recreated. None of you, everything, just the atoms will all mix up again. And plus, you're just like a fucking peon that was like a rock turned into this, turned into a fucking fish, turned into a like thing that crawled up. It's gonna everything in life just eats the other thing with its face and kills it and consumes its flesh. And it's just nature red in tooth and claw and all this. Like essentially, whether you're like, you're just an ant on a hill of dirt in the corner of a world where nobody pays attention and your God is indifferent or the force. Yeah, that will be quite a terrifying notion to some degree. And I think it's why people are so depressed and people have so much anxiety and they have nothing to live for and they think everything's worthless. And as a result, they think like it justifies all sorts of just selfishness and being a twat and not really giving a fuck what other people care about. Yeah, some of that's quite horrible. So I would just say in general, what answer would bring me the most joy? I'll probably formulate it like this. Existence, whether or not it's necessary, permanent or finite, is joy if you choose to enter into it with the right understanding or the right mindset. You're willing to take it on those terms and always find a lesson in a failure and always find something to be grateful for, even in scenarios where you lack other things. I think a lot of it's mindset. Now, if you'd like to support this AMA, I'll be doing the next one a lot sooner, then subscribe to my Patreon, Thorin's Side, buy some gamer subs, and obviously I'll do a poll and I'll put some questions in there that I can answer at further length. This video was kindly supported by Bar Ado Mushroom. Want to get on Thorin's side and support me further? Well, thanks to my side channel Patreon, you can. And in doing so, gain some or all of the following perks. Find out upcoming guests for my interview series. They're fairly eclectic, aren't they? Ask me questions for my AMAs. Participate in exclusive, recorded for you, but never to be released conversations with myself. Gain access to private channels on my Discord. Select topics I will address in future videos and many more. To find out more or to subscribe yourself, go to the Patreon link in the description box below.